Africa is making progress, a progress that could be aided as development takes hold and more people gain access to better services. Welcome to this video that will be talking about what Africa will look like in 100 years' time. Africa is currently the world's fastest growing continent with rising GDP, and some of its countries, like Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt, are enjoying relative wealth. However, the continent is home to 3/4 of the world's poorest countries. Africa's population is booming. In the next century, it will be home to about 4.4 billion people, which is 4 times larger than its current population. Studies have made us understand that by 2050, more than half of Africa's 2.2 billion people will live in its rapidly expanding and smart cities. That is the equivalent of China's population. However, there are many issues for Africa to grapple with in this 21st century, and all of these issues are interconnected in its urban world. According to the UN, as Africa accommodates 2 out of 5 of the world's people, in 100 years to come, it must create an infrastructure that will improve the education, health, security, and economic prospects of its inhabitants. All these must be done at the same time, as Africa builds sustainable governance systems, which would underpin all other issues. There are other problems at large. Urban populations are rapidly increasing, environmental hazards, access to transport and energy supply, amongst others. As data collection improves in Africa, decision makers can get access to better and more reliable statistics and facts. Click the like button and subscribe to our channel because we give you all what you need as information. We'll be right back. In order to make this video more interesting and easier to grasp, we shall be asking questions and providing possible answers, as well as looking into various moves in different domains of the African society. Can Africa translate its huge population growth into economic development and improved quality of life? Population growth may bring forth positive effects on the economy. In the United States, for instance, an increase in population will lead to more access to labor, which will lead to higher productivity, and consequently, more goods will be produced. This is not the case on African grounds, as most of its counties have higher birth rates and a youth dependency ratio, both of which rather lead or contribute to economic slump. The UN has counted more than 71 African cities, with a population higher than 750,000, many of which lack the infrastructures to support huge populations. A higher birth rate contributes to a low per capita income, and in the long run, it contributes to poor economic advancement. Most African cities are growing at an unstoppable pace and are expected to contain much more people in the next 5 years than they do now, say 100 million more. What is troubling is that the African continent continues to suffer from very rapid urban growth, accompanied by massive urban poverty and many other social problems. A great population increase has been witnessed since the second half of the 20th century. Eastern and Central Africa, including countries such as Kenya and the Congo, had the highest population growth. Meanwhile, those in the south and north, such as South Africa and Tunisia, saw less growth. Such a trend is likely to increase, but so far, population growth has not equated to prosperity. What then can be done to improve economic development in Africa? A 2022 report from the World Bank stipulates that African countries need to undertake bold, domestic structural reforms to scale up the supply capacity of the region by improving digital connectivity, reforming fundamental institutions of legal frameworks, such as contract enforcement and poverty rights protection, maintaining stable and competitive exchange rates, and low inflation, as well as lightening the regulatory burden. Stakeholders also need to improve access to imported inputs through low domestic tariffs and enhancing access to infrastructure through the creation of effective special economic zones. A lot can happen in 100 years. 100 years ago, most African countries were still thriving under colonial umbrellas, yet, within at least 60 years, this dissolved almost faster than it came. Much has been said about the potential of Africa's economic growth and development. Some world observers have even gone as far as labeling the modest rise of some African countries as the emergence of the African lion economies, to emulate the success of the Asian tiger economies of Singapore, Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, that industrialized rapidly in the 1960s and 70s. What is likely to happen in 100 years from now is that Africa will not simply be seen as the poorest continent, although it may still have significant poverty. As Chinese and other foreign investments continue to grow in Africa, Western domination may likely come to an end, especially if projects like the Chinese Belt and Road constructions are completed by 2060. Africa is going to gain more allies in international policies as years go by, and this will surely bring about socioeconomic and infrastructural development. India and Japan are offering an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative through the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which is based on joint infrastructural projects in the Indian Ocean and a sub-regional cooperation framework. Population mobility has been a permanent feature of African history and is likely to increase in a century from now. Increased connectivity through mobile phones and the internet will boost migration because people will be more informed about different countries. Some communication experts have said better communication will also reduce the psychological impacts of migration, as it will be easier for migrants to stay in touch with family and friends at home. Contrarily, other people are for the fact that, although majority of African migrants will remain within the continent, many will relocate to Western nations. In about 20 years from now, it is expected that in the US and Europe, 32% of the population will be aged 60 and more. In the absence of an increase in fertility in the West, immigration will be necessary to maintain a strong labor force and pensioner ratio. Africa has the potential to support much of this labor. What will become of Africa's natural resources that serve as a generator of wealth and social fief? In 100 years from now, many of Africa's current mines will have been stripped off their assets. According to the African Development Bank, this does not necessarily mean that the continent will earn less in natural resource revenues, but rather, these opportunities will have shifted in both location and composition. South Africa, which is unarguably one of Africa's top miners, will move from being a resource-rich country to a resource-scarce coastal economy. Industrialization will depend upon integrating into world markets, and so will cluster at the major ports of Durban, Cape Town, and East London. However, some African countries that are currently not major oil and mineral producers will become so because of new discoveries and changing global demand. By 2050, with the massive urbanization, 864 million people, that's about 57% of Africa's population, will be found in the urban regions of the continent. Lagos, which is the current largest city in Africa by population with an estimated 18.6 million inhabitants, is expected to be home to double its current population. This opens the race for the provision of good housing for the continent's teeming urban dwellers, who in 2014 represented 40 to 80% of its population. According to UN Habitat, Africa's security challenges will play a role continuously, as it has in the past few years, on its capacity to grow exponentially and drive all-round development. Given Africa's potential GDP from $2 trillion to $29 trillion by 2050, investments in the continent might still be crippled by its feeble security challenges if not well handled. The good news is that Africa's adoption of technology across its essential structures has widened access to security, with more predictable business span for investments. There will be a declining agricultural importance in Africa in 100 years to come. Rain-fed African agriculture is considerably more climate-sensitive than agriculture elsewhere. Soil degradation will have substantially increased due to population pressure, and there will be a significant decrease in suitable rain-fed land in the production potential for cereals and other crops. That doesn't cancel the fact that this impact will not be strongly felt if adequate adaptation measures are put in place. You've just heard of the many different things that might change in Africa in 100 years' time. However, this may not be a smooth transition, as it might threaten the viability of Western Europe in particular. While it is unlikely that any European country would attempt to directly recolonize any African country, trade disputes and meddling in elections will become more common sanctions. Reparation for slavery and colonialism is a crucial topic in the West and is something that is avoided at all cost by governments and policymakers. It is unlikely that reparations will ever be willingly granted by any imperial power to Africa. However, if such scenarios should come up, what will be the aftermath? The answer to this is still unfound. Western countries would offer a type of conditional reparations that the countries of origin will accept on grounds colluding to restrict migration. It will be a far cry from the process conceived by freedom groups. At the beginning of this video, I made mention of other problems that Africa faces, which need to be trashed, so that in 100 years from now, the continent will boast of having taken a step forward. These problems include 1. Climate change. Climate change in contemporary Africa poses a significant threat to economic, social, and environmental development. There is strong evidence that warming in Africa has increased significantly over the past 50 to 100 years, with clear effects on health, livelihoods, and food security of the people of Africa. 2. Hunger and malnutrition. These are also a problem to African development. According to UN statistics, the poor state of food security and nutrition in Africa is spurred mainly by conflicts, climatic changes, and economic slowdowns following the COVID-19 pandemic. In countries like Cameroon, a persisting secessionist conflict in the northwest and southwest regions since 2016 has caused great havoc to the country's food supply chain. These two English-speaking regions have been a breadbasket for the country in recent years, but now food prices are rising in the rest of the country because of conflict there. In 2020, about 281.6 million Africans suffered from hunger. The number of undernourished people reached about 44% in Eastern Africa, 27% in Western Africa, 20% in Central Africa, 6.2% in Northern Africa, and 2.4% in Southern Africa. 3. Rising costs of living. Inflation is on the rise around the world, and in Africa, high prices is bringing more turbulence. The World Bank projects that annual inflation will exceed 10% in 2 years from now in 7 countries, including Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Angola, driven by rising oil prices, droughts, and supply chain disruptions. Protests against rising costs of living and food security are seen in countries such as Ghana and Malawi. Governments should resort to price controls to avoid unrest. 4. Spillover of militancy. If you've been following news about African countries, then you will notice that Islamic militant groups across the sub-Saharan region are working ceaselessly to expand their territorial reach. In the Sahel, the Al-Qaeda affiliate Nusrat al-Islam will continue to make roads into western Mali, northern Ivory Coast, and northern Benin, where it has already even established networks. Similar dynamics are also at play in countries like Congo and Mozambique, and border areas of southern Tanzania. 5. Armed conflicts. The conflicts between armed forces and civilian groups in many African countries have increased unrest in the continent for many years now. We will not be talking about them detailedly here, but you can find out what keeps transpiring in places like Algeria, DR Congo, Uganda, Niger, Kenya, Tanzania, Togo, Mauritania, and Angola to know exactly the point I am trying to raise. Armed conflicts in Africa continue to strain government finances and undermine investor confidence. Other issues to be addressed are environmental sustainability, equal opportunities for all, agriculture, and infrastructural development, amongst others. Creating more jobs, building critical skills, improving access to water and sanitation, and strengthening health systems are some possible measures to go along with the aforementioned problems. There is a famous Safari quote which states that Africa has her mysteries, and even a wise man cannot understand them, but a wise man respects them. Out of colonialism and imperial rule to independence and now growth and advancement, nor matter what it takes with time, there are hopes that the face of Africa will change, so much in a positive perspective, in 100 years from now. In your own opinion, what will be the future of Africa? Feel free to express your thoughts and tell us what you expected from this video that didn't feature in the comment section. Hit the like button if you had a great time watching this video, subscribe to The New Tourist, and share massively with your friends and family members so that we can grow together. Thanks for watching and see you in our next video.